Ymedia Group, the fastest growing media group in North America.
Hello and welcome to the newsroom, Ymedia's newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh, and it's always so great to spend this time with you. We have all the updates you need to know about what's happening in the summit in China between the U.S. and China's president. In terms of what does it mean, the markets have been watching quietly to see where these two superpowers land. The two biggest economies on many different things when it comes to semiconductors, AI, competition, trade. And that is literally what's driving the markets today. And really big announcement from Prime Minister Mark Carney here in Canada when it comes to the energy security of this country. He's made some really big announcements today. We're talking about $1 trillion of investment. We're going to bring you all of those details today. So starting with what is taking place in China, essentially, the Chinese president Xi Jinping has reportedly issued one of his strongest and starkest warnings to President Trump. And the only thing that is the red line that the Chinese president is essentially drawing for Trump is when it comes to Taiwan and how to handle Taiwan. That is one of the biggest issues. Everything else seems to be going really well when it comes to trade and business and opening up the markets to each other, which essentially has been the trade tensions since last year. And so all of that seems to be in place. Even the issues around the Iran war seems to be secondary to Taiwan. And of course, we're going to explain to you why that's the case. But essentially, the Chinese president essentially, drew the red line on Taiwan and really did point out that it could lead to clashes and even conflict if the U.S. gets in the way in terms of how it's positioning itself with Taiwan. And we'll cover what the U.S.'s relationship with Taiwan is, and obviously Taiwan is watching very closely to see what comes out of this summit. So this is essentially the big thing in the elephant in the room that had to be discussed, and that is Taiwan is the greatest risk to U.S. and China relations, and this is what has been articulated to President Trump. And then of course there is AI, semiconductors, and the military tension specifically around Taiwan, and even semiconductors that is tied to Taiwan. Same with this AI race. And I'll break it down in much more detail. So essentially, China has declared, right, that Taiwan should be a part of China and not an independent country. Taiwan is next to China. It is an island country. It is a country that has even really close economic ties with Canada and the United States and the Western world. It is one of the biggest manufacturers of semiconductors. It has a very advanced, educated, hardworking population. And essentially, Taiwan has wanted to become an independent sovereign nation. And to that, it's tried to be, enter the UN, but UN only takes sovereign nations. And because of China's pressure, has not taken Taiwan as one of the representative countries. And to that, Taiwan does a lot of delegations. It does a lot of outreach when it comes to the Western world to bring delegates over to Taiwan, to show them their economy, to show them their way of work, and the close economic relationships it has with the Western world in a way to be able to protect itself from the big China next door that claims that Taiwan should be part of China. Now, this is part of China's rule of one China policy. And Beijing has repeatedly avowed that there will be an eventual reunification between Taiwan and China into one country, and has also articulated that that would be either by force, if necessary, if not through diplomacy. And even though the United States has officially recognized the one China policy, it still has, sold arms to Taiwan to militarize itself It's also supported its defense as well as maintained very deep unofficial ties, given that Taiwan is not an independent country. It's not recognized as such internationally. And we saw that take place with the previous US administration under Joe Biden as well. And so Taiwan has always been a point that the US has said, leave it alone. And that's why this summit is so important. And Taiwan is watching, Israel is watching when it comes to the Iran conflict, but also the markets when it comes to this. Two countries that have massive economies. And this is the red line that was drawn. So essentially, the reason Taiwan is the biggest issue here between the two countries is because of the AI competition, the semiconductor dependence that the world has now with AI and EVs and all of that. And Taiwan essentially produces a majority of the world's advanced semiconductors. And this is why it's so critical. And this is why China also wants to be able to claim it for many other reasons, but it's also very strategic. And so this is a fine line that President Trump has to essentially walk when it comes to how he's going to deal with the Chinese president on trade tensions and Iran and everything else. And this is a time where the president is not doing so well in America, right? We have inflation numbers in the United States hit 3.8%. Unaffordability crisis is at its peak with increased gas prices at over $4.53 a gallon. And that's just the national average. Other states are more at the, $6.50 a gallon. So life is becoming unaffordable. And when it comes to the job numbers, unemployment numbers, and what this country has spent on this previous war with Iran, that is still in a stalemate of reaching a peace agreement. So that's some of the headlines for President Trump before he takes this trip. Not really starting the trip on a high note in terms of his numbers in his own country. And to that, there's actually been some backlash that's been created as of earlier today and yesterday when President Trump says that he doesn't think about Americans' finances when it comes to the Iran war, because majority of that has been, hey, things have become unaffordable. The 3.8% inflation, 40% of that is energy prices. And the energy prices have increased because of this conflict with Iran and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And to that, President Trump is essentially saying he's not worried about the finances. He cares about the war and the nuclear proposal with Iran. So that's some of the backlash that he's been getting from at home. It shows in the decisions that this president has made. And now he let it slip that he doesn't think about Americans' finances when it comes to the war in Iran. And because of the backlash he's received online, essentially the White House decided to walk that back and say, no, President Trump did not mean that he doesn't think about Americans' affordability crisis and their finances that are being stretched and limited. He really cares about making sure Iran is not a nuclear threat. And that's what he really meant, and he misspoke because, the White House does measure his numbers. They measure, what the response is, what are his, electability. And of course, the White House cares because this administration is a Republican administration. There is the midterms around the corner. And because of that, there's also all this redrawing of, the districts, right? In terms of the voting areas for the districts, a lot of that's being redrawn. Yesterday, Louisiana had happened, and it's had a really bad backlash. We're going to cover that for you in more detail later. But, this White House administration really is seeing, how much different people's sentiment towards this president are just from a year ago. He's only been at the job for, almost a year and a half, not even a full year and a half. And already the sentiment towards this president has changed, and he let it slip in terms of why he's made these decisions that he has when it comes to this war. Imagine spending $1 billion a day on a war, and Americans are like, hey, we need that money. We need it in our healthcare. There's been, cuts to Medicaid. There's been cuts to so many services for Americans. And of course, when it comes to American infrastructure, when it comes to what it could be doing in its own country, all that money went into a war, which majority of Americans are saying that this war he was led into by the Israeli prime minister, and he's essentially making sure that what Israel wants, Israel gets, is what the people in America feel, because they can't understand why they've been in this war in the Middle East. And because of that war, it has effectively taken, United States into higher inflation rates. That's the highest in 3 years since 2022. So it's very significant, for what's happening in the United States. So here is this president who shows up to this summit, with all of this hanging over his shoulders, over his head. When it comes to the Iran issue, which is what we've been all watching, because China is a direct stakeholder in this conflict with Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. Essentially, 40% of its oil comes from the GCC countries, including Iran, and the ships pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Yesterday was a test from China's side because their ship was able to get through. They picked up oil from Iraq and they were able to get through the Strait of Hormuz no problem. These vessels have their flags on them, and so the China flag was on the vessel, and everything went smoothly. We know that the US ships are there. We know the Iranians are there. We know all kinds of ships and from all angles are there, and the China ship vessel, containing oil, was able to have no issue yesterday. And of course, no surprise, because if there was an issue, then it would definitely impact this summit significantly. So where does it stand when it comes to Iran? The summit is today and tomorrow, so this is what we're going to be watching for. Essentially, a lot of people, and you got to tune into what the consensus are. They believe that, the Chinese president essentially has a leverage on this point. And why is it so? Well, because we know that the latest numbers that have come out of the United States in terms of its inflation, it being involved in, so many different conflicts at the same time, the U.S. military resources are stretched. And this conflict, this 39-day conflict, war with Iran, essentially impacted even the stockpile, the ammunition stockpile of the United States. So you have, a U.S. military that's absolutely stretched. You have the inflation numbers that we talked about, and at the same time, Washington is, in the middle of this Middle East tension. Aside from just Iran directly with a peace proposal agreement, it still has to answer to Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Oman, all these countries that have U.S. military bases that have been attacked in the conflict that started on February 28th with Iran. So there's that, and then it's in the middle of this whole Ukraine-Russia thing, which this president said he was going to be able to settle, weeks after getting elected, and now it's almost a year and a half later, and to his promise, it doesn't look like that is ending. There was a truce between the two countries, Russia and Ukraine, for their V-Day celebrations, and then right after that, you had Russia hit 200 missiles into Ukraine, and that's just been escalating. So those are some of the realities. And then there is the Indo-Pacific security, and this is, a major aspect of it. And then, of course, there's the U.S. tensions with NATO, U.S.'s tensions with the European Union, and lots of issues that this president has, to deal with on this trip, in terms of weighing on him. And that's why China looks like they have it together in comparison to President Trump. So President Trump is essentially, walking this fine line between creating a stable relationship with China while increasing its pressure on Iran. And we know China is a direct stakeholder of that conflict. And then at the same time, President Trump has to show that it's supporting Taiwan. Meanwhile, it's agreeing with China on the One China policy. And then there's the restricting of Chinese AI access and the race with China for AI. And so, yeah, it's a lot of things at the same time. And so it is a balancing act that is quite difficult to handle. But of course, you need someone who is sound-minded and, diplomatic to be able to handle so many different things that are going on that would be in conflict of one another, but how to handle it. But when it comes to the business end of things, when it comes to the economy, well, Beijing Summit is hosting American CEOs. So the American CEOs that have accompanied President Trump on Air Force One, we saw, them. You have Tim Cook, you have Ymedia's CEO Jensen Huang, you have Elon Musk, and so they're there, and especially for Elon Musk, Tesla was one of the most biggest auto company in just a few years ago. And even though it didn't have to do with its sales, it was its projections in terms of how it broke into the market as really a premium style electric vehicle. And it was kind of revolutionary at the time when Tesla, broke all those records. Even so, it became like the most highly valued car company compared to Toyota and Honda. Even though they had more sales, it was just, what the projections were for Tesla. And now when you look at what's happening with the Chinese EV market, Tesla can't compete. China EV market is about 56% of the global market. That's how much market share they have. And this is just the beginning of it. So here's Elon Musk looking at companies like BYD and to see, what are they rolling out, and those EVs are now coming to the Western countries and more specifically to Canada. And if you were to look at the Chinese auto show, you just be wowed. Last week we showed you how great some of these EV vehicles look out of China, Chinese manufactured, and they're a fraction of the cost of a Tesla. And so here you have the entire thing where these CEOs are showing up to see, like, what is the competition here in China? What is being done so well? And that's why, they're there. And when it comes to semiconductors, that's now become the new geopolitical weapon, right? Which country is going to lead in semiconductors right now? It's Taiwan. And that's why Taiwan's such a critical issue, because it sits at the center of advanced chip manufacturing, AI infrastructure, which of course, it's semiconductors are needed for AI infrastructure. These data centers, this race to have all these data centers up and running, that's a big component of it. And so, and then now with AI integrated into military weapons and military grade monitoring, military technology, this is, the forefront of how semiconductors have become a geopolitical weapon. And for most of this summit, this is really the driving point on it, with the red line on Taiwan. So the markets are watching very quietly to see, how they feel about this diplomacy that's taking place. The markets are calm right now because there hasn't been any massive thing coming out of the summit. So far, it seems quite positive on both sides. And so that's very critical on some of those things. And Chinese President Xi Jinping has also shown that Beijing is ready to reopen, more aggressively for foreign investment, for foreign businesses, as it's hosting these American CEOs that have accompanied President Trump, essentially saying that, executives like Elon Musk, Tim Cook, and Jensen Huang, who are meeting with Chinese officials, are now underscored that, they can have access to the Chinese market, which President Trump has essentially asked for. And we know that when President Trump won his second election, his second term last year, he was essentially the tariffs that he was imposing on all these other countries was to essentially say, there's tariffs if you have your manufacturing plant or if you have your businesses where jobs are in other countries. But if you pick up your headquarters, if you pick up your manufacturing plants, if you pick up your businesses and bring them over to America, you will not have the tariffs and then have, hire Americans to work and have your head of your headquarters or your manufacturing operations here in the United States, and use the supply chains in the United States, and then you won't have to deal with the 20, 25, 30, 50% tariffs. And so a lot of that took place, and now China is of course saying, hey, we're open for American businesses too, right? To see that, hey, it did work when President Trump pulled that one. We even saw Canadian companies leave and go open up an office in the United States or have more presence in the United States just to be able to, bypass this entire tariff situation. So now the Chinese president is signaling that it's open for business, and it wants to be able to attract more foreign investments into its own country. And why is that, right? Because right now China is trying to reassure foreign investors to come to be able to have the global markets expand out of China, and make sure that these major U.S. corporations still want to be in China and to be able to bring their businesses, invest their capital, hard-earned dollars, and to be able to create these technology partnerships. Because we know when these technology partnerships take place, it's very difficult to undo them, and especially where things are headed with AI and how much things have changed in the technology front. And so China needs this foreign investment again, right? Because the economy has essentially slowed down. What is the state of China? Well, it's got, it's now starting to have a weak property market. There is an increase in youth unemployment. You have, falling foreign investment that's taken place in the last little while. And there's been a lot of manufacturing pressures that have taken place for when it comes to Chinese exports into the market. So China is trying to create, a boost in what would be foreign corporate confidence to make sure that, companies feel safe by having, their business fronts out there. And of course, at the same time, China is competing with India as well for some of that. We saw what happened where a lot of the shifts of industry moved over to India when there was the conflict with the United States, and India was there to kind of take some of that market share, because again, India also has, English as a language that their business community speaks. It has an educated workforce, and it has the capabilities to be able to be part of this AI race as well. So that's also a strategic key thing too, that China, of course, doesn't want to lose its capabilities to countries like India as well. So you have, some of these really high-end things that are taking place. But when you look at, what does Elon Musk's, sort of investment in China? Well, Tesla, which is Elon Musk's company, has the largest manufacturing hub globally in China. The Tesla Shanghai factory reportedly sold 293,000, so about 300,000 vehicles in just the 4 months of 2026. So can you imagine selling, 300,000 vehicles in just the first quarter of this year? So that is a 26.7% increase year over year. Apple alone still has, because Tim Cook's there, has 80% of iPhones sold in the US are still made in China. Even though some of that business went to India for manufacturing, some of that, it's still 80%, is coming out of China. And Ymedia, well, before the US restrictions on China, Ymedia was reportedly controlling 95% of China's advanced AI chip market. So massive things. So when it comes to China's AI market alone, it's projected to be about $50 billion this year alone. So that those are very significant numbers that the president of the United States cannot ignore. And this is why it's a big part of this summit. And so to that, President Trump has essentially called the Chinese president to say, hey, open up China and let American businesses come in and compete with Chinese businesses. To that, it looks like, that sounds like the president of China has, essentially said, yeah, we do need the foreign investments, and maybe, having healthy competition will help. But we also know in China, there are state-owned corporations. So it's backed by the government. So really, are you competing with privatized Chinese companies? That's a whole nother thing. But it's about having access to a market where, you have 1.3 billion people and a very growing country in terms of its market. So that's where things are at between the two nations. Of course, we're going to keep watching what comes out of the summit. When it comes to, the trade tensions, when it comes to the Taiwan situation, and of course, any restrictions that may be lifted for the technology purposes, but also to see, where things are at with the conflict with Iran. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back and talk about what's happening here in Canada.